After 4 years of being careful, I finally let him in. He met my sister. He met my daughter. The Sunday lunch was perfect. He was perfect. Then the good morning texts stopped. And 48 hours later, my phone lit up with a single cowardly message that erased 6 months of my life. And started this story. The cursor blinked, a tiny, insistent heartbeat in a sea of white. Thinking about Sunday? My sister Sarah is having lunch at her place. Very casual. She'd love to meet you. I'd love for you to be there. Let me know. I'd written and deleted the text 4 times. The first draft was too eager, full of exclamation points that screamed, "Validate me." The second was so casual, it sounded like I didn't care. This one was the truth. It was simple, it was honest, and it terrified me. My thumb hovered over the send icon. A simple blue arrow pointing up, a symbol of forward, but my hand was frozen. I could feel my pulse, a quick, bird-like flutter in my throat. I locked the screen. The glass went black, reflecting my own face, 47 years old, my eyes pinched with a worry that I thought I'd left behind. I pushed myself off the sofa, a deep blue velvet that had seen better days, and walked into my kitchen. The apartment was my sanctuary, 10 floors above the city, smelling faintly of old books and the lemon oil I used on the shelves. On the wall opposite, a Vermeer print. A woman in a blue jacket reading a letter, her face bathed in a soft, private light. I'd had her for 20 years. I always wondered what was in that letter. Good news or bad? I poured a glass of water, the tap whispering in the silence. I stared at the glass but didn't drink. It had been 4 years. 4 years since the divorce papers were signed, since Mark had packed his meticulously organized boxes and left a silence so loud it rang in my ears. In all that time, there had been men, a few dinners, a handful of awkward goodbyes in my lobby, a few 6-week flings that evaporated like morning fog. But not one of them had crossed the threshold of Sarah's house. Not one of them had been allowed into the inner circle, and absolutely none of them had met Chloe, my daughter. 21, and more perceptive than I'd been at 40. She'd been my shadow, my tiny, fierce defender through the whole divorce. She'd watched me disassemble, piece by painful piece, and she'd been there as I'd slowly put myself back together. Her trust was a fragile, precious thing, a filament I'd built a fortress around us. But David had, for the past 6 months, scaled the wall. Or, more accurately, he'd just stood outside it patiently, without ladders or threats, until I'd found the courage to open the gate. We'd met at an art and AI panel I was moderating. He was a VP at a tech firm that promised to optimize human connection. The irony wasn't lost on me. He'd found me after, at the dreadful networking reception, holding 2 glasses of warm, acidic Chardonnay. "Do you really think an algorithm can replicate pathos?" he'd asked. His eyes, a clear, intelligent gray, crinkled at the corners. He hadn't tried to impress me. He'd just started a conversation. Our relationship was built in the spaces between. The text at 7:03 a.m. sharp. Morning. Saw this, thought of you. A link to an obscure music critic. A think piece on urban planning. His texts were full sentences, perfect grammar, no emojis, just words. He was 50, established, and he wasn't broken. He didn't seem to need fixing. He just seemed to like me. We'd spent a Saturday at the Met, not talking, just looking. I'd been intensely aware of his presence, a solid, steady warmth beside me. We'd had dinner at a tiny Italian place in the village, the kind with checkered tablecloths and bad art. He'd put his phone, face down, on the table. A gesture of pure, undivided attention that, in this city, felt more intimate than a kiss. He'd listened. He'd remembered the title of my thesis. He remembered that I hated cilantro. The smell of his coat was wool and something clean, like sandalwood. The weight of his hand on the small of my back as we crossed the street was light, respectful, but proprietary. He made me feel seen. He used the word we. He spoke of the future, our future, as if it were a tangible place we were walking toward. I went back to the living room, the water untouched. The phone was dark. The Vermeer woman was still reading her letter, caught in that perfect, quiet moment. Mark had taught me to be safe. He'd taught me that vulnerability was a liability, an open door for betrayal. I was tired of being safe. I was tired of being a museum piece, safe behind glass. I wanted to be in the world. David felt like the world. I picked up the phone. My reflection stared back, and I held her gaze. I unlocked the screen. The message was still there. The cursor blinked. I took a sharp breath, held it, and pressed the blue arrow. Whoosh! The bubble snapped into place on the right side of the screen. Delivered. My stomach hollowed out. It was done. I stood up and walked to the window, wrapping my arms around myself. Below the avenue was a river of headlights, red and white, silent and distant. He was out there somewhere. His phone would be lighting up. His smartwatch would be vibrating on his wrist. What would he think? This is moving too fast. This is what I've been waiting for. My own vulnerability felt like a sudden cold draft in the room. The silence stretched. 1 minute, 2. I was already composing the back pedal. The digital retreat. No pressure, really. We can just grab a drink instead. The phone vibrated on the coffee table. A sharp, rattling sound that cut through the silence. I spun around. The screen was lit. David. My heart gave a single, painful kick. It hadn't even been 3 minutes. I snatched it up, my fingers fumbling with the screen. A new message. I'd be honored. Can't wait to meet them. I sank onto the sofa, reading the words until they blurred. Honored. Not cool or sure or sounds good. Honored. A warmth, deep and real, spread through my chest. The knot of fear in my stomach didn't just loosen. It dissolved. I had taken the risk. I had shown him the key to the fortress, and he hadn't just taken it. He'd been honored to. I looked back at the window, at the city lights. They seemed brighter somehow, closer. Sarah's house didn't just smell like home. It smelled like life. The second she opened the door, we were hit with a wall of warm air, rich with roasting garlic, thyme, and the faint, sweet scent of the apple pie I knew was cooling on the counter. Her ancient golden retriever, Buster, shuffled over, tail thumping, and leaned his entire body against my leg. "You're late," Sarah announced, pulling me into a hug that smelled like flour. She was 52, my older sister, and still commanded a room with the same pragmatic energy she'd had at 12. Her eyes, the same as mine, flicked past me to David. "And you must be David." She wiped her hand on her apron before extending it. Sarah. Good to finally put a face to the texts. "Get in here." "It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Sarah," David said. His voice was smooth, warm. He held out the bottle of wine he'd brought. "I remembered Elena saying you were a fan of Sancerre. This one is from a small vineyard, supposed to be excellent." Sarah's eyebrows lifted, just a fraction. Impressed. "A man who listens and brings good wine. All right, you can stay." She winked, but her eyes were still assessing. David just smiled, a polished, easy smile. And this must be Chloe. Chloe was leaning against the doorway to the living room, arms crossed. My daughter, all sharp angles and sharper intelligence, her phone in her back pocket like a reflex. "Hi," she said. It wasn't warm. It wasn't cold. It was data gathering. "I read that article you shared last week on the new haptic feedback loops," David said, not missing a beat. "The one about generative AI? It was brilliant. Your insights on the sensory gap were spot on." Chloe's arms uncrossed. "You read that?" "I work in the field," he said, "but your take was fresh. We could actually use that perspective at my firm." I felt a swell of pride. He'd listened. He'd remembered the Sancerre. He'd read my daughter's college blog. He was here. He was blending our worlds, and it was working. For the first 2 hours, it was perfect. David was the perfect guest. He told a genuinely funny story about a disastrous tech conference in Berlin. He helped Sarah carry the platter of chicken to the table. He asked Chloe about her coding class, and he actually understood her answers. I found myself relaxing, letting the warmth of the room, the food, and the easy conversation settle over me. I watched him laugh, the sound deep and genuine, and I thought, this is it. This is real. This is working. We were halfway through the pie when Sarah started telling a story about her new, impossible-to-train puppy. He has no shame, this dog, she was saying, gesturing with her fork. He'll look me right in the eye while he's chewing my shoe like he's the one who's disappointed in me. We all laughed. The conversation flowed, easy and light. And in that moment of shared laughter, I saw it. David's left hand, which had been resting on his knee, slipped down. It disappeared beneath the lip of the heavy oak table. My own laughter caught in my throat. I kept my eyes on his face. He was still smiling, nodding at Sarah, his gaze fixed on her. They say you have to establish dominance early, he said. His voice perfectly engaged, but under the table, I saw a faint blue-white light flick on, illuminating the edge of his dark jeans for just a second. Then it was gone. He'd checked his phone, mid-conversation, mid-laugh. He hadn't missed a beat, hadn't broken eye contact. And that somehow was worse. It was a practiced, perfect disconnect, a cold pinprick of something touched my chest. Chloe saw it too. I knew she did. Her eyes darted from David's face, down to the table, and then, immediately, to mine. She didn't say anything. She just took a slow, deliberate sip of water. I scrambled to fill the sudden, tiny silence. Speaking of no shame, I jumped in, a little too brightly. Remember that Thanksgiving, Sarah? At Aunt Carol's? When I was 12 and tried to impress that boy from next door by... Sarah groaned, dropping her head. Oh God, Elena, not the Jell-O mold incident. The Jell-O mold incident. I was laughing, the story tumbling out, how I'd tried to carry the enormous, wobbling mold, tripped over the rug, and ended up face down in a sea of lime green Jell-O and suspended mandarin oranges. With the boy watching in horror from the porch, Sarah was howling. Chloe was giggling into her napkin. It was one of our family's greatest hits, a story of pure, unadulterated humiliation that had, over time, become hilarious. I turned, still wiping a tear from my eye, to share the laugh with David. He was smiling, a perfect polished smile, but it wasn't in his eyes. His gray eyes, usually so intelligent and warm, were buffering. They were distant. He was looking right at me, at this moment of deep, personal, embarrassing family lore, and he was a million miles away. The performance was flawless, but the actor had left the stage. The cold pinprick became a sting. Right, Sarah said, standing up and starting to stack plates. The mood shifted. The meal was over. David, be a doll and give me a hand with this in the kitchen. It was not a request. Of course, he said, standing immediately. I started to gather the glasses, but Chloe's hand landed on my arm. Mom, she said, her voice low. Let them talk. I froze. What? They're just clearing plates, Chloe. No, they're not. Her eyes were steady on mine. Just wait. I sat back down, my hands gripping the edge of the table. The silence from the living room was thick. I couldn't hear the words from the kitchen, just the clatter of plates and the low, percussive murmur of voices. Sarah's sharp and staccato, then David's, a smooth, placating rumble. It wasn't an argument. It was an interrogation. It lasted maybe 2 minutes, but it felt like an hour. Then, footsteps. They both returned, all smiles. The performance was back on. Well, David said, checking his watch. A real overt check this time. This was incredible, Sarah, Elena. But I've got that early call with the London team tomorrow. I should probably head out. The goodbyes were a flurry of coats and compliments. So lovely to meet you all. The food was amazing. Yes, you too, Chloe. Let's talk about that article again soon. He saved his final act for the doorway. In front of my sister and my daughter, he pulled me in, cupped my face, and gave me a long, affectionate kiss. It was a good kiss. It was a public kiss. Your family is amazing, he whispered, loud enough for them to hear. He squeezed my hand. He drove. His car, a sleek, silent Tesla, felt like an extension of him. a hermetically sealed bubble of new car smell and quiet technology. The city skyline rose up to meet us, a glittering, impersonal grid of lights. The silence in the car was heavy, digital. He turned on the navigation, even though he knew the way. A polite, female-voiced AI began giving directions. He put his hand on the center console, palm up. A gesture. I slipped my hand into his. His skin was cool. I replayed the day. The sincere, the compliments, the smooth, practiced answers, the phone under the table, the dead, smiling eyes as I told my story. David's thumb stroked the back of my hand, a repetitive, mechanical motion. I stared out the window at the endless stream of red taillights. The warmth of Sarah's house felt 1,000 miles away. The doubt wasn't a pinprick anymore. It was a small, cold stone settled deep in my stomach. The Tesla hummed, a low electric thrum that was more a vibration than a sound. It was the only sound, other than the polite, disembodied voice of the navigation, telling David to continue straight for 2 miles. He kept his hand on the center console, but I didn't reach for it. My own hands were clasped in my lap, my knuckles white. I watched the city blur past, a stream of neon and halogen, bright squares of light that were other people's lives. Warm lit windows. We pulled up to my building. The brass and glass doors reflected the streetlights. Leo, the night doorman, gave a small, discreet wave. David put the car in park, but he didn't unbuckle. He didn't turn to me. He faced forward at the lobby. The performance was over. Well, I said, my voice sounding thin. Thank you for coming, David. I know... I fumbled for the word. I know my family can be a lot. It was great, Elena. He finally turned, but his gaze was on my ear, not my eyes. Really, your sister is great. Chloe is very sharp, great, sharp. The words were like smooth, polished stones. No warmth, no life. I'll talk to you tomorrow, I asked, my hand on the door release. Of course. He nodded, a quick, efficient motion. Early start. That London call, remember? He leaned in, and I met him halfway for the kiss. It was nothing like the one in the doorway. It was a brief, dry press of lips. A contractual obligation. A period at the end of a sentence. I got out. Good night, I said. Night. The heavy door thunked shut, sealing him inside his bubble. The silent white car pulled away from the curb, disappearing into the river of traffic. I was left on the sidewalk, the city air sharp and cold, stinging my cheeks. The next morning, I woke at 6:45, the same as always. My first instinct, a habit baked in over 6 months, was to reach for my phone. I'd unlock it, and there it would be. The 7:03 a.m. text. Morning. Saw this, thought of you. My thumb swiped the screen. 7:03 a.m. The lock screen was empty, just the time and the date. 04 a.m. I sat up. The apartment was still, the pre-dawn light a cold gray. He's busy, I thought, pushing back the covers. The London call. He said he had an early start. He's just being efficient. I went to the kitchen. The sound of the coffee grinder was an industrial shriek in the silence. I made my coffee, the dark, bitter smell filling the room. But I barely tasted it. Femme, still nothing. I got dressed for work, my mind a million miles away. I stood in my bedroom, pulling on a cashmere sweater, and realized 5 minutes later that I had put it on inside out. The seams were stark and ugly. I ripped it off, my skin feeling raw, and threw it on the bed. I felt a jittery, anxious energy humming just beneath my skin. This was stupid. He was a 50-year-old man, not a teenager. We weren't kids. He was just busy. A Sunday with the family. It was a big step. Maybe he just needed space to process it. But he always texted. It was our thing, the constant low-level connection. It was the architecture of our modern relationship. By 1:30 p.m., I was at my desk at the museum, supposedly cataloging a new acquisition of Dutch miniatures, but I was just staring at my phone. The silence was screaming. I couldn't take it. I typed, "Hey, hope the London call went well." Thinking of you, I hit send. It felt light, breezy, normal. The blue bubble sat there, delivered. I stared at it. I watched the three little dots, willing them to appear. David is typing. Nothing. I tried to work. I pulled up the database, but the words swam. I was thinking about his face at the table, the smile that didn't reach his eyes. Sarah's direct, pragmatic question in the kitchen. Ping. My heart leaped. I grabbed the phone, my hand clumsy. A new text? Yep, swamped. Talk later, that was it. Not talk to you later. Not can't wait. Not even busy, but thinking of you too. Swamped. Talk later. It was a text you'd send to a colleague. A status update. A door, gently but firmly closing. The rest of Monday was a fog. Tuesday was worse. The 7:03 a.m. text did not come. The digital void was complete. It was a physical ache now, this absence. Our entire relationship, built on a scaffold of constant communication, was being dismantled, text by text. I was in a cab on Tuesday afternoon, stuck in gridlock. On the sidewalk, a river of people flowed past, every single one of them staring down at their own small, blue-lit screen. They were talking, texting, laughing, connecting. I was in a city of 8 million people, all connected by devices, and I had never felt so utterly, profoundly alone. That night, I sat on my blue velvet sofa, the glass of water from Sunday still on the counter, untouched. I pulled up our message history. I scrolled. Up, past swamped. Talk later. Past I'd be honored. 6 weeks ago. Just read that essay you sent. You're right. The author completely misses the point about negative space. You've ruined me for other art critics, Elena. I only want to hear what you think. 1 month ago. Bad day. The board meeting was a nightmare. Can I just come over and listen to you talk about 17th century painters for an hour? Need to remember there's beauty in the world. 3 weeks ago. I'm not just dating you, Elena. I'm building something with you. I want you to know that. I read the words over and over. The digital proof. The black and white evidence of his love? Or had it just been a performance, too? Had I misread everything? The Jell-O mold story. My mind snagged on it. I was too much. I'd shown him the messy, undignified, real part of me. The 12-year-old covered in lime green Jell-O. He'd signed up for the poised 47-year-old art historian. He'd met the real chaotic family and seen the real clumsy me, and now he was swamped. I couldn't just sit in this digital silence. I couldn't let swamped be the last word. My hands were shaking. I typed, David, is everything okay? It was a raw plea. All pretense of breezy was gone. I was vulnerable. I was asking. I hit send. The blue bubble appeared. Delivered. I stared at the phone, my pulse hammering in my ears. The apartment was silent. On the wall, the Vermeer woman was still reading her letter, her expression unreadable. I sat there. 1 hour. 2. The city lights outside my window were bright and cold. The screen stayed dark. The 3 little dots never appeared. The silence was the answer. Wednesday morning. The gray light of dawn was just beginning to seep through my blinds, but I'd been awake for hours. I'd been lying in the dark, my phone on the pillow next to me, its screen dark. I had at some point in the long, silent hours of the night picked it up and looked. Below my 10:14 p.m. text, David, is everything okay? Was a new, tiny, gray word. Read. He had seen it. He'd read my plea, and he'd gone to sleep, or he'd gone to dinner, or he'd watched a movie. He had done something other than respond to the woman he was supposedly building something with. That single word, read, was a small, sharp act of cruelty. It was a digital scene, an acknowledgement of my pain, and a simultaneous refusal to engage with it. The digital void was no longer an absence. It was an active, cold presence. I got up. The floor was cold beneath my feet. I moved through my apartment like a ghost. I showered, the water scalding hot, but I couldn't feel it. I made coffee I didn't drink. I put on a silk blouse, a charcoal gray blazer, and tailored pants. Armor. I applied makeup with a steady hand, a mask of professionalism. The Elena in the mirror looked composed, competent, unbothered. She was a complete stranger to me. The commute on the subway was a special kind of torture. I was pressed in on all sides by bodies, by the smell of damp wool and stale coffee. And every single person was on their phone. A young woman to my left was giggling, her thumbs flying as she texted. An older man across from me was smiling softly at a video of a child. It was a world of connection, a web of signals, and I had been unplugged. I was the dead node. Work was, impossibly, just work. The museum was quiet, the floors buffed to a high sheen, the air still and cool. I went to my office. I answered emails. I approved a font choice for a new placard. I was floating, disassociated, watching my hands type words that made sense. Approved. Pending review. Let's circle back. At 11 a.m., I had the weekly curatorial meeting. I sat at the long, polished mahogany table in the conference room. Mike, my director, was at the head, droning on about Q4 outreach and patron engagement. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee from the carafe in the corner and the chemical tang of whiteboard markers. And the metrics on the Masters of Light exhibit are tracking 17% above projection, Mike was saying, which is fantastic. Elena, you wanted to discuss the acquisition budget for the new Dutch miniatures? I opened my mouth. I had a whole presentation in my head. I had a passionate argument for why we needed to secure the collection. Zzz. My phone, lying face down on the table beside my leather-bound notebook, vibrated. The sound was sharp, abrasive against the wood. Everyone at the table flinched. Mike paused, his mouth open. Chloe's roommate, my colleague, shot me a quick, sympathetic look. A phone going off in Mike's meeting was a cardinal sin. Sorry, I murmured, my face flushing hot. I didn't even look at it. It was probably just Chloe, or a spam alert. My heart, which I had thought was dormant, gave a single, stupid, hopeful leap. I cleared my throat. Yes, Mike, the miniatures. I believe the data shows... Bzzz, bzzz, it vibrated again. 2 quick short bursts. A text, not an email, not an alert. A text. My blood went cold. My carefully constructed armor, the silk blouse and blazer, suddenly felt like tissue paper. Mike was looking at me, his annoyance clear. Elena, do you need to take that? His voice was clipped. No, I couldn't ignore it. The entire room was waiting. My hand, which I was disgusted to see was trembling, reached out and flipped the phone over. The screen lit up. My heart stopped. David, not a call. Not a response to my, is everything okay? Not an apology. Just a new message. My hands felt numb, clumsy. I swiped the notification. The blue light of the screen was cold, clinical. Hey, I've been doing a lot of thinking. Sunday was great, but it made me realize I'm not in a place to be this serious. You're a wonderful person, but this isn't going to work for me. I wish you the best. I read it once. The words didn't assemble into sentences. They were just pieces. Hey, Sunday was great. Not in a place. Wonderful person. Wish you the best. I read it again. This time, the meaning hit me. It was a physical blow. The air punched out of my lungs in a silent whoosh. The room tilted. Hey! He'd started our entire relationship with a question about pathos. He was ending it with, hey, Sunday was great, but, the pivot. The negation of everything that came before. The Sancerre, reading Chloe's article, the kiss in the doorway. It was all erased by that but. I'm not in a place to be this serious. Serious. He'd met my family, and that was serious. He had used the word building. He had held my hand in the museum and spoken about our future. But Sunday? Sunday, with its roasting garlic and jello molds and the pragmatic questions from my sister, that was too real. That was serious. You're a wonderful person, but the second but, the casual disqualification, the polite, devastating dismissal, it was a template. It was the text you send to someone you went on 3 dates with, not someone you'd spent 6 months of your life with. It was the corporate rejection letter. We've decided to move forward with other candidates. I wish you the best. The cold finality. The sound of a door being locked, bolted and barricaded. Elena? Mike's voice was a distant buzzing sound, like a fly trapped in a jar. I looked up. The faces around the table were staring at me. Mike, Sarah, my other colleagues. They were all looking, their expressions a mix of confusion and impatience. My vision tunneled. The polished table, the notepads, the faces, it all blurred at the edges. All I could see was the phone, the glass screen glowing with those terrible, efficient words. The abandonment. It wasn't just that he was ending it. It was how. This cowardice. This text. He couldn't even grant me the dignity of his voice. He couldn't give me the respect of a phone call, of seeing my face. He had met my vulnerability, my open, trusting, terrified vulnerability, and he had swiped it away. He had hidden behind 378 characters. Elena, are you with us? Mike asked. I couldn't breathe. The air in the room was too thick, too warm. The smell of stale coffee was making me sick. I tried to speak. My voice came out as a dry croak. I had to get out. I had to get out of this room. I couldn't be this person, this competent professional woman, not for one more second. I stood up. My chair scraped against the hardwood floor, a sound like a scream in the quiet room. Excuse me, I whispered. I didn't look at Mike. I didn't look at anyone. I turned and walked out of the conference room. I left my notebook. I left my blazer on the back of the chair. I left my bag. I left everything. I just walked, my sensible heels clicking on the marble floor, my phone clutched in my hand so tightly my knuckles ached. The blue light of the screen was still on, a cold, indifferent beacon. I didn't know where I was walking. My heels clicked on the museum's marble floor, an impossibly loud, sharp sound in the cathedral-like silence of the atrium. Click, click, click. Each step was a hammer blow, echoing in the vast, empty space above me. I passed the ticket counter. I passed the blue-blazered docent by the entrance to the Dutch wing. She smiled at me, a polite, practiced museum smile. I must have looked normal. I couldn't feel my face. My only goal was to put one foot in front of the other. To move, to flee. I had left my blazer, my bag, my life, draped over the back of a chair in that conference room. All I had was the phone, clutched in my right hand. The screen had gone dark, but I could still feel the words burned into it, radiating a cold, sick energy. I saw the heavy wooden door with the small brass woman etched into it. The restroom. I pushed the door. It hissed shut behind me. The sound of the atrium cut off instantly. The silence here was different. It was a dead, muffled hum of ventilation. The smell was sharp, antiseptic, industrial soap and bleach. The floor was a sea of tiny white hexagonal tiles. The light was a flat, unforgiving fluorescent glare. The room was empty. I stumbled into the last stall, the one by the wall. My trembling fingers fumbled with the metal latch, sliding it across. The clack of the bolt was definitive. Safe. I was safe. I didn't sit. I leaned my back against the partition, my legs shaking so violently I was afraid they'd give out. I slid down until I was sitting on the closed toilet lid, my head bowed. I opened my hand. The phone was slick with my palm sweat. I looked at it. Hey, the greeting of a stranger. The opening line of a man in a coffee shop, not the man who had slept in my bed, who knew I kept Earl Grey tea in the canister marked sugar, and who had kissed my daughter's forehead. I've been doing a lot of thinking. When? Last night at 10:15 when you saw my "Is everything okay?" and chose to ignore it? Were you thinking then? Or was this a pre-written draft, saved for the right, efficient moment? Sunday was great, but the great, terrible but. The pivot, the moment the performance ended and the escape plan was enacted. The Sancerre, the compliments on the food, the discussion of Chloe's article. All of it was just data gathering for his exit speech. He'd sat at that table, a perfect guest, while running a cost-benefit analysis in his head. And my family, my life, my vulnerability had been filed under too serious. I felt a heave in my chest, a desperate, sudden need for air, but I couldn't inhale. It was a physical weight, pressing down on my lungs. You're a wonderful person, but... The second but, the pat on the head, the consolation prize. You're wonderful, just not for me. No, it was worse. It was, you're wonderful, but this being me, my family, my Jell-O mold stories, my reality, is not. I wish you the best. The corporate sign-off, the HR dismissal. So clean, so efficient, so utterly, monstrously cowardly. He hadn't just broken up with me. He had optimized the breakup. He had deleted me. He'd done it in the middle of a Wednesday, knowing I'd be at work, knowing I'd be in a meeting. He'd done it to avoid the mess. He'd done it to avoid my voice, my questions, my tears. He'd done it to avoid being a human being. I stared at the blinking cursor in the reply box. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. What was I supposed to... I'm right back, okay? Thank you for letting me know. Go to hell? A wave of nausea, hot and acidic, rose in my throat. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and fumbled with the lock. I stumbled out of the stall to the long line of white porcelain sinks. I gripped the cold, smooth edge of the counter. I stared at myself in the mirror. The woman staring back was a horror. Her face was chalk white, her eyes wide and dark, her mouth a pale, thin line. The armor was a joke. My silk blouse was rumpled, a small, dark coffee stain I hadn't even noticed near the collar. My hair, which I'd so carefully smoothed, was coming undone. I looked, abandoned. And the insult, the pure, searing disrespect of it, finally hit me. This was the man I had worried about, the one I had built a fortress around my daughter to protect. This was the man I had finally deemed safe. This man who didn't have the simple, fundamental courage to use his voice. He'd built our entire relationship on a scaffold of words, clever, thoughtful, constant texts. And he just used that same scaffold to tear it all down. My thumb, shaking, moved away from the keyboard. I would not reply. I would not type, okay. I would not give him the satisfaction of a delivered and a read. I would not participate in my own execution. Replying to that text was accepting his terms, agreeing that this was a valid way to end 6 months of a life shared. They would not. My gaze fell on my phone's favorites. My vision was blurry. I could feel the tears, hot and sharp, pressing against the back of my eyes, but they wouldn't fall. It wasn't grief yet. It was pure, unadulterated shock. I needed a voice, a real one. I needed the antidote to this cold digital poison. I needed my sister. My finger stabbed at the screen, at the small icon next to Sarah's name. It was shaking so badly I missed it, opening my email by mistake. A list of unread messages about Q4 budgets. I backed out, my breath coming in ragged, tiny gasps. I focused, my index finger, press, hard, Sarah. I pressed the small green phone icon beside her name. The phone began to ring, the sound impossibly loud in the white-tiled room. 1 ring, 2. I pressed the phone to my ear, the glass cold against my skin. My other hand splayed out, flat against the cool tile wall, just to hold myself upright. Come on, Sarah, I whispered, my voice a dry, broken thing. Pick up, pick up, pick up. 3 rings, 4. My entire body was vibrating, a taut wire humming with a frequency of pure panic. I was going to be sick. The white hexagonal tiles on the floor swam, blurring into a gray-white sea. Pick up, pick up, pick up. Elena? Sarah's voice was sharp, distracted, full of, I'm in the middle of something energy. What's up? I'm just wrangling. Sarah, I whispered. The sound that came out of my throat was not my own. It was a dry, scraping, terrified sound. The background noise on her end, a dog barking, the clatter of a keyboard, stopped. Instantly. Her voice changed, dropping an octave, all distraction gone. It was the voice that had found me on my bathroom floor after Mark left. Elena? What's wrong? Where are you? I'm at work, I managed. I'm in the bathroom. What happened? Are you hurt? Talk to me, I tried to form the words. I looked at my reflection in the mirror, the pale, shocked woman. The phone clutched to her ear. I tried to explain, to give her the context, the nuance, the humiliation, but my brain couldn't build the sentences. I started. A sob, hot and violent, finally broke free. It wasn't a cry. It was a gasp. A painful, ugly sound that tore out of my chest. He broke up with me. He what? Sarah's voice was a whip crack. That bastard. Did he come to your office? Did he do it in public? No, I choked out. The tears were coming now, hot and silent, just rolling down my cheeks and dripping onto the white porcelain sink. No, I couldn't say it. It was too pathetic, too small. Elena, how did he do it? He sent me a text, I whispered. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. It stretched for 3 full seconds. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was not warm. It was not comforting. It was a low, cold, controlled fury I hadn't heard in years. He what? A text, I repeated, my voice breaking on the word. He sent me a text, Sarah, like I'm nothing. Like I'm a dentist appointment he's canceling. That, she spat out a word, low and vicious. That gutless, spineless child. I knew it. I knew it in my kitchen, the way he looked at you. Like you were a new app he was testing. I was in a meeting, I sobbed. The full humiliation washing over me. The whole team. Mike. My phone just kept, and I read it in front of everyone. Okay. Sarah's voice snapped back into tactical mode. Listen to me. Are you safe right now? Yes, you're in the bathroom. You're safe. I want you to splash cold water on your face. Right now. Do it, I fumbled, turning on the tap. The water was icy. I cupped it in my shaking hands and splashed it on my face, the cold a sharp, welcome shock. I gasped. Good, she said. Now you are going to walk out of that bathroom. You are going to walk back into that conference room. You are not going to look at anyone. You are going to pick up your bag and your blazer. You're going to tell Mike you have a family emergency. A migraine. The plague. I don't care what you tell him. You are going to walk out of that building, get in a cab, and come straight to my house. Do you understand me, Elena? My notes. Your notes don't matter. Nothing matters except you getting out of that building. I'm leaving work. I'll meet you there. I'll have the kettle on. Sarah, you don't have to... Shut up, Elena. I'm your sister. It's a non-negotiable. Now go. I'll see you in 30. And Elena? Yeah? I whispered, grabbing a rough paper towel and blotting my face. Do not, under any circumstances, reply to that text. Don't you give him the satisfaction. You hear me? I wasn't going to, I said. Good. Now, hang up and go. The line clicked dead. Sarah's voice, real and raw and furious on my behalf, was the antidote. It was the jolt I needed. The cold, digital poison of David's message was still there, but it wasn't paralyzing me anymore. I took a deep, shuddering breath. I looked in the mirror. My face was blotchy, my eyes red and swollen. I looked like I'd been crying. I looked exactly like I'd been crying. I turned on the cold tap again, soaking a wad of paper towels. I pressed them to my eyes, holding them there until the skin went numb, until the swelling felt like it had receded. I ran my fingers through my hair. I straightened my silk blouse, which was now damp armor. I unlocked the stall. I walked back to the conference room. My steps were steady. Click, click, click. The sound was different now. It wasn't a hammer. It was a march. I pushed open the heavy door. The conversation stopped. 8 pairs of eyes snapped to me. Mike was mid-sentence, a purple marker in his hand. He looked furious. "Elena, we're in the middle of... I have to go." My voice was low, rough, but it didn't shake. I walked past the table, past the curious, annoyed faces. I went to my chair. I picked up my leather-bound notebook. I grabbed my bag. I slid my arms into my blazer. "What?" Mike said, dumbfounded. "You're just... leaving?" I turned to face him. I met his gaze. I didn't care about his budget meeting. I didn't care about the Dutch miniatures. I didn't care about Q4 outreach. "I have a sudden blinding migraine," I said. The words tasted like ash, but they came out clear. "I can't be here." "I'm sorry," I didn't wait for his response. I didn't look at my colleague, Chloe's roommate. I didn't say another word. I just turned and walked out of the room for the second time. But this time, I had all my pieces. I walked out of the museum, past the docent, past the ticket counter. I pushed through the revolving glass doors and out onto the wide stone steps. The city hit me like a physical force, a blast of cold, damp air that smelled like bus exhaust and roasted nuts. The sound was a roar, sirens, horns, the rumble of 1,000 cars. The sidewalk was a solid, surging mass of people, a river of strangers, all moving, all with somewhere to be. I stood at the top of the steps, frozen as the world rushed past me. The noise, the cold, the sheer indifferent energy of it all. I was supposed to get in a cab. I was supposed to go to Sarah's, but I couldn't move. My apartment was empty. Sarah's house was safe, but I wasn't ready for safe. I was shattered. I stood there, invisible, a ghost on the steps, and let the cold, impersonal city swallow me whole. I don't know how long I stood there on the museum steps, a stone in the middle of a river. The city surged around me, a chaotic, indifferent blur of yellow cabs, delivery bikes, and faces. So many faces. And every single one of them was looking down. In the crosswalk, a woman in a sharp business suit was mid-stride, her thumb flying across her screen. A man beside her, headphones on, was laughing at something on his. They were all connected, plugged in. Their worlds were humming with signals, with messages, with lives that were moving forward. My world had just stopped. A blast from a bus's air horn, a sound so loud it vibrated in my teeth, finally broke the spell. I stumbled down the last few steps, propelled by the sheer force of the crowd, and was absorbed into the flow. I started walking. I had no destination. Sarah's house was uptown. My apartment was downtown. I just walked east, toward the park, my feet moving on their own, a simple, mechanical motion. Click, click, click. The sound was softer on the concrete, swallowed by the traffic's roar. The cold, damp air, which had smelled like exhaust, now carried a new scent, the sweet, sticky smell of roasted peanuts from a cart on the corner. A man with a briefcase bought a bag, handed over his money, and immediately pulled out his phone to take a picture of it. Optimize human connection. David's company motto echoed in my head, a bitter, hollow joke. I kept walking, block after block. My feet, in their sensible but not this sensible heels, began to throb. A dull ache that started in my toes and worked its way up my calves. I welcomed it. It was a real physical pain, a counterpoint to the hollow, icy void in my chest. I felt flayed, exposed. I was walking down a public street, a respectable 47-year-old woman in a blazer, but I felt as naked as the day I was born. I felt like everyone who passed me could see it. They could see the raw, red mark of his dismissal. They could read the text, branded on my forehead. You're a wonderful person, but... My mind kept replaying the words, a torturous loop. Hey, the sheer, calculated impersonality. He'd spent 6 months mining me for data, my favorite painter, my thesis topic, the name of my childhood dog. He'd learned my sister's favorite wine. He'd read my daughter's blog. He had all this information, all this intimate personal data, and he'd distilled our entire relationship down to, hey, he was at his desk right now. I was sure of it. He'd sent the text, and then he'd moved on. He was probably in a meeting, using words like synergy and scalability. He had swamped himself as an alibi. He had efficiently, cleanly, and without any messy emotional fallout, closed my ticket. Problem resolved. User deleted. A new hot wave of shame washed over me. The Jell-O mold story. I'd given him that. I'd handed him that piece of my past, that absurd, embarrassing human moment. And he'd held it, looked at it with his dead gray eyes, and filed it under, not in a place to be this serious. I hadn't been a person to him. I'd been a project, a phase, and Sunday. Sunday, I had failed his final review. I found myself at the edge of the park. The trees were bare, their branches black, skeletal fingers against a sky that was turning a deep, bruised purple. The sun was setting. The city was shifting from day to night. Office lights were winking on in the tall buildings that bordered the park, creating a new artificial skyline. I found an empty bench. It was dark green, the paint peeling, the wooden slats cold and damp. I sat. My legs gave out with a gratitude that was almost painful. I sat, hands clasped in my lap, and just watched. A young couple sat on the bench opposite me under the weak yellow glow of a park lamp. They were maybe Chloe's age, 21, 22. They were huddled close, sharing a pretzel. And they were both on their phones, not talking to each other, just together, side by side, their faces illuminated by the small, blue screens, their thumbs scrolling. They were in their own separate, digital worlds, sharing the same physical space. And they looked content. This was his world. This was the world David was optimized for. A world of connection without the risk of actual connection. A world where you could perform intimacy, send the links, text the good morning, but where you were never, ever required to show up for the messy, uncurated, Jell-O mold reality of another human being. He hadn't been a coward. Not really. A coward knows what's right and fails to do it. David just didn't think it was necessary. A phone call? A face-to-face conversation? That was inefficient. That was messy. Why do that when a text would achieve the same result? The cold was seeping through my blazer now, into my bones. The park was emptying as the last of the light faded. I was just a dark shape on a bench. Anonymous. Invisible. My phone vibrated in my pocket. My heart didn't leap. It just seized. A cold, hard fist. I didn't want to look. I was terrified it was him. A follow-up. An are we cool? Or worse, an oops, wrong person. I sat frozen, the vibration humming against my leg. It stopped. Then, immediately, it started again. Bzzzt. Bzzzt. This wasn't David. This was urgent. My fingers, numb with cold, fumbled in my pocket. I pulled out the phone. The screen was blindingly bright in the dusk. 2 new messages. The first was from Sarah. 6:15 p.m. Elena. You never showed. Where are you? I'm worried. My breath caught. I'd been walking, wandering, adrift for almost 5 hours. The second message, just seconds old, was from Chloe. Mom? Sarah's worried. Are you okay? She said you left work. A third message popped up as I was reading. Chloe again. Mom, please answer. Just text me that you're safe. My real life. My actual non-digital, messy, and real life. They were looking for me. They were worried. The warmth of Sarah's kitchen. The scent of garlic and thyme. The sharp, intelligent look in my daughter's eyes. I stared at Chloe's text. Please answer. A simple plea. A real one. Not a performance, not a dismissal. A hand reaching into the cold digital void where I was floating. I looked up from the phone. The young couple on the opposite bench was gone. The park was dark. I was alone on a cold bench in a city of 8 million people. My thumb, no longer shaking, moved across the screen. I tapped on Chloe's name. I'm safe, sweetie. I'm okay. My finger hovered. I wasn't okay, but I would be. I deleted it. I typed again. I'm safe. I'm on my way to Aunt Sarah's now. I love you. I hit send. Then I pulled up Sarah's name. On my way. Sorry. Got lost. See you in 20. I stood up. My knees cracked. My feet screamed in protest. I didn't care. I walked out of the park, back onto the bright, loud avenue. The yellow cabs, the buses, the river of headlights. It wasn't a roar anymore. It was just the city. I raised my hand, my real physical hand, into the cold, sharp air. The taxi smelled of old coffee and cheap, pine-scented air freshener. The driver had a talk radio show on, a low, angry murmur of voices arguing about something I couldn't comprehend. I just watched the city pass, a different city than the one I'd walked through. This one was all reflections. The red and white of the taillights bled across the wet pavement. The windows of the buses were dark mirrors, flashing past. It was a cold glass and steel world, full of hard surfaces. I felt the throb in my feet with every red light, a dull, aching reminder of the miles I'd walked. I was exhausted, scraped raw and hollowed out, but the panic was gone. The shock had finally crystallized into something hard and cold, a kind of bleak, quiet clarity. We pulled up to Sarah's street. Her house was the only one on the block that seemed to have any life. The windows weren't just lit, they were glowing, a warm, buttery yellow that spilled out onto the dark, damp sidewalk. It looked real. I paid the driver, the crinkle of the bills a small, real sound. I walked up the 3 stone steps. I didn't hesitate. I rang the bell. The door was thrown open before the chime had even finished. Sarah was standing there, her hair a mess, her face pale with a worry that instantly contorted into a furious, profound relief. "Oh, thank God," she breathed. And then she had me. She grabbed my arms, pulled me inside, and wrapped me in a hug so tight it almost cracked a rib. She didn't smell like flour this time. She smelled like wool and coffee and her. "You're freezing," she muttered into my hair. "What the hell, Elena? What were you thinking, walking around for 5 hours? I wasn't," I murmured into her shoulder, my voice muffled. "Mom?" I let go of Sarah and looked past her. Chloe was standing at the entrance to the living room, her arms wrapped around herself. My daughter, all of her sharp edges softened by a fear that cut me to the core. I had done that. My thing. With David, it had hurt her too. "Hey, sweetie," I said. My voice was rough. She just walked over and joined the hug, burying her face in my other side. We stood there for a long time, a 3-person knot in the entryway. Under the dim light, Buster, the old retriever, whining softly and nudging his head against my hand. Finally, Sarah pulled back, her hands on my shoulders. "Right, kitchen, now. You look like a ghost. I'm making tea. The strong stuff." The kitchen was a mess. The Sunday lunch dishes were still stacked in the drying rack. There were papers all over the table. It was the warmest, safest room I had ever been in. Sarah didn't ask questions. She just moved. She filled the kettle, the water a roar from the tap. She slammed 2 mugs onto the counter. Chloe pulled out a chair for me, and I sank into it, my legs giving out. The kettle began to shriek, a high, piercing, analog sound. It was the loudest, most human sound I'd heard all day. Sarah poured the boiling water over a tea bag, the steam rising in a cloud. She shoved the mug in front of me. "It's scalding," she said. "Drink it." I wrapped my numb hands around the ceramic. The heat was immediate, almost painful. I brought it to my lips and took a sip. It burned my tongue. It was real. "So," Sarah said, leaning against the counter. "Tell me." I looked at her. I looked at Chloe, who was watching me with that still, perceptive gaze. "There's nothing to tell," I said, my voice flat. "You know it all. He met us. He met this." I gestured around the kitchen. "And he decided it was too serious. So he sent a text." "I knew it," Chloe said, her voice low. I looked at her, surprised. "What?" "At the lunch." She picked at a loose thread on the placemat. He was like a really good chatbot. He had all the right answers. He'd read my article. But his eyes, Mom, when you told that story, the Jell-O mold one, he wasn't there. He was just running an empathetic response script. A dry, bitter laugh escaped me. "A chatbot. My God, you're right. He's a coward, Elena," Sarah said, her voice sharp. It's that simple. He's a 50-year-old child who saw something real, something that wasn't perfectly curated, and he ran. This isn't about you. This is about him. This is about a man who has built a life where he never has to feel anything he doesn't want to. A life where he can just swipe left on a person. I stared into my tea, the dark, swirling liquid. She was right. He hadn't been honored to meet my family. He'd been auditing them, and we'd failed. This messy kitchen, this pragmatic, furious sister, this brilliant, sharp-eyed daughter. This was the mess he'd run from. This was the serious he couldn't handle. This love. My phone, which I'd set on the table, vibrated. All three of us froze. The sound was obscene in the warm room. "Don't," Sarah said, her voice a warning. I looked at it. It wasn't a text. A notification from my Photos app. A new memory for you. 6 months ago. Today, a small thumbnail picture. Me standing next to David at the Art and AI panel. We were both holding glasses of that terrible acidic Chardonnay. We were smiling. His arm was draped lightly over my shoulder. His gray eyes were crinkling at the corners. The performance. The perfect, charming start. "What is it?" Chloe asked, leaning in. I didn't answer. I just stared at the image. The ghost. The digital echo of a man who didn't exist. My hand was steady. I picked up the phone. I didn't open the memory. I opened my contacts. My thumb scrolled. B.C.D. David. I pressed his name. The contact card opened. His face, the one I had chosen, smiled at me. Below it, the options: message, calls, FaceTime. I thought, just for a second, of the Vermeer woman on my wall, forever reading her letter, her face a perfect, unreadable mask. I'd always wondered what was in that letter. I knew what was in mine. It had been an invitation to this kitchen. An invitation to this. To the real, the messy, the true. And he had RSVP'd no from a safe digital distance. I scrolled down. Block this caller. Delete contact. My thumb hovered over the red letters. Chloe's hand slid across the table and covered mine. Her skin was warm, a little calloused from her keyboard. Real. I looked up. I looked at her worried, beautiful face. I looked at Sarah, who was watching me, her eyes fierce. This was the antidote. This was the connection, not the constant, low-level buzz from a device, but the solid, warm, present weight of a hand in mine. My thumb pressed delete contact. A small window popped up. "Are you sure you want to delete David?" I didn't hesitate. I pressed delete. The name, the picture, the number, it all just vanished. He was gone. The screen was just an alphabetized list. C, E. The D's were empty. I locked the phone. The screen went black, a blank, polished rectangle. I turned it face down on the table next to my half-empty mug. I took Chloe's hand, lacing my fingers through hers. I looked at Sarah and managed a small, watery, real smile. I took a deep breath, and for the first time since Sunday, it didn't feel like I was suffocating.